Now on the screen again we have the two verses that we've based these studies on, and if you'll turn over the page from the reading we had tonight to verse 30 of John chapter 20 and verse 31, and this is the reason we've had this series of studies, as we know, and which we've enjoyed together. And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name. And so we've come to that state, haven't we, where we have read about John's record about Jesus' signs that he did amongst the people. And we are amongst those who have believed that Christ is, the Son of God, and that we do believe that we can have life through his name and through none other or by any other means. Well, let's start straight away into John chapter 21 and read the first 3 verses. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and on this wise showed he himself. There were together Simon, Peter, and Thomas, called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples. So we're introduced to a small group of 7 disciples who had gathered together in Galilee. Simon Peter is named first amongst this little group, and then Thomas is named next. Now, what other occasion was Thomas named second? I don't recall of any other occasion when Thomas was actually named second in the group of the disciples. It seems like from the verses in the latter verses of the previous chapter that Thomas, doubting Thomas, had put his doubts behind him when Jesus had specifically revealed himself to Thomas and shown that he was alive. And Thomas accepted that, and his comment was, "My Lord and my God." So Thomas had moved on from his doubts, and despite the situation they were all in, he was in a good space to face the future, and now it would seem was in the forefront of the disciple group. And then we have the sons of Zebedee mentioned, of course, James and John, but John was not about to name himself in his own gospel except by inference. Now, you may recall that Peter had been... Now, we're going to talk about Peter because he's the main character and subject of interest in this story, although John very much features in it, though he puts himself to the background. You may recall that Peter had been so focused on declaring his loyalty to Jesus that he had not taken in what Jesus had said. Now, how often are we in that situation where we hear about Jesus and his ministry and we don't always take it in? Well, neither did Peter. And I refer to what Jesus had said to the disciples after his resurrection to meet him on the shores of Galilee. Now, Peter had been so busy trying to declare his loyalty to Jesus on the occasion before Jesus' death that he had not listened to Jesus' instructions about meeting him after the resurrection on the shores of Galilee. In fact, they had no idea that he was going to be raised, even though he told them. And in Mark chapter 14, verse 28, Jesus had said to them, "After I am risen, I will go before you into Galilee." Later in Mark chapter 16, verse 7, the women who came to the tomb at the resurrection and discovering that Jesus had risen were told by one of the angels, "Tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee." So the angels also made sure that Peter heard that detail. And it shows to some extent the level of detail the angels had and presence they had in the lives of the disciples of Jesus and their families and their loved ones. Anyway, the message had got through, and at least some of the disciples were on the shores of Galilee waiting to see him, and no doubt they were staying in their homes with their families. Now, as I said, there are 7 disciples mentioned here: Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, and 2 other unnamed disciples. Perhaps they were meeting initially at Nathanael's house at Cana of Galilee. I'll point that out. Here at Cana, and they possibly stayed at Cana because that was Nathanael's hometown, and that's 3 times now that the town of Cana of Galilee has been mentioned in the 8 signs of John, which is rather an interesting side fact. And perhaps they stayed there on their journey, broke it up into 2 days' journey, and eventually ended up at their hometowns near the Lake of Galilee. And Bethsaida was the home of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. And ironically, Bethsaida means the house of fishes. So they probably ended up, it's not shown there, but Bethsaida's just on the east side down from Capernaum, on the east side of the lake. And perhaps that's where they were staying as they waited for Jesus. Well, there's tension as they're waiting for Jesus. They don't know when he's coming. It's very much like ourselves, isn't it? There's tension in our lives too. We're waiting for Jesus as well. And everything hinges on that, doesn't it? It doesn't matter what's happening in our lives. The waiting for Jesus is the principal thing, isn't it? And everything hinges on that. We know it's soon. We have doubts and fears about that. We have that keep coming into our mind. And so we are anxious as well. I'm sure you feel that as we wait for Jesus. Well, of all of them, Peter was probably the most anxious as he wrestled with his troubled and anxious thoughts about recent events. And you know what I'm referring to, his denial of the Lord. And perhaps the other disciples with him were anxious as well, but at the same time, they may have been trying to help Peter in this crisis in his life that he was facing. And it's obvious they needed some sort of distraction while they waited. Well, it got too much for Peter. And he said, I'm going fishing. It was a distraction for them to go fishing, but nevertheless, obviously Peter felt he needed to, and the others followed. They were going back to what they knew. And the waiting was too tense, too difficult to cope with. And in the eventual reunion of Jesus and his disciples in Galilee, in the divine plan, it was always going to be on the lake, wasn't it? Or on the shores of the lake. Well, verse 3, as we've read, they went fishing, they fished all night, and they caught nothing. The tension and the frustration they felt was probably worse than ever now. With no reward for all their efforts, they'd taken out 2 boats, so it was a significant amount of effort to go fishing. And they had no reward. And to rub salt in the wound, someone from the shore says, have you caught anything? And so let's read verses 4 and 4 to 6. But when the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples knew not that it was Jesus. And he said unto them, cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find. And they cast therefore, and now they were not able to draw it for the multitude of fishes. Well, someone called from the shore and have you caught anything? They eventually and reluctantly replied, no. The figure outlined on the shore by the rising sun says, try the other side. Now, giving advice to professional fishermen, especially in their own hometown waters, is bound to be answered with a gruff and mumbled reply. Like, you think we haven't been doing that all night? Or you think we've only been casting our net on one side of the boat for 12 hours? Obviously not. But there's something compelling about the stranger on the shore and his words. And of course, the results in doing what the person told them proves that. With their tired bodies and minds, it was John who realised that this stranger had to be the Lord. Therefore, verse 7, therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he girt his fisher's coat unto him, for he was naked, and did cast himself into the sea. So it was John who first realised that, as we would expect, that it was the Lord. Just going back to pick up the lesson from verse 3 about the tension and frustration they felt fishing all night with no reward. Sort of encapsulates, doesn't it, the times of frustration and lack of success we have in our own lives from time to time. It says the expression they caught nothing says it all, doesn't it? And it hints at the tendency we have, as they did, to do things their own way in spite of the help available through prayer and trust in God's ways. So we're also subject to that feeling of frustration at times. Now, I'd like you to turn to 1 John chapter 2, because here John uses the same expression that Jesus used when he called out to the disciples on the boat. 1 John chapter 2. Chapter 2 and verse 1. John writes in his letter to the believers many years later, my little children, these things I write unto you. And in verse 12, I write unto you, little children, because your sins are forgiven. Verse 18, little children, it is the last time. Verse 28, and now, little children, abide in him. Chapter 3, verse 7, little children, let no man deceive you. Verse 18 of chapter 3. My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. And so that proves, doesn't it, that John never forgot this incident or this scene, because that was the term that Jesus used in verse 5. Then Jesus saith unto them, children, have ye any meat? Have ye caught anything? And that term children there refers to little children. He would have remembered that his childlike faith at the time and previous to Jesus' resurrection, and how the Lord had showed great patience with them through their discipleship and the need to progress in the love of God, which is, of course, an exhortation for us today, and to do the same. And so he penned those words in his epistle much later on. So back to the narrative in John chapter 21. This silhouetted figure on the shore says in verse 6, cast the net on the right side. There's something compelling about this voice of the stranger on the shore, with, as I've said, perhaps grumbling and reluctance. They haul up the net, which is empty, And then they, with some considerable effort, cast it on the other side of the boat with incredible results. They struggle with the weight and the volume of fish, the disciples concentrating on trying to get the net to land, trying to get the net firstly in the boat, but it wouldn't go in the boat. It was so large, so many fish. And the other disciples in the other boat see what's happening. Then, as I said, the net is not able to be hauled in either boat, so they come to help in the other boat. Still not naming himself, but confident in the love of his Lord, John identifies himself, as I've said, and says it's the Lord. Well, Peter wasn't ready either for that revelation. He was in surprise and shock. He recognises immediately that John's right, that it is the Lord, and perhaps over the days before that, he had been worrying about meeting Jesus again, going over it and over it in his mind, and now Jesus was here and he wasn't prepared. How that experience, we can feel that experience in ourselves as well, with our state of preparedness or lack of, and lack of awareness. Peter's reaction is dramatic and impulsive, as we've read here in verse 7. He grabs his coat and then he jumps into the water to get to shore. He wasn't naked as we understand it, the term to mean in our day, but unclothed in the sense that he had taken off his outer coat, possibly to give himself more room and flexibility to haul in this huge net full of fish. I get the sense from the narrative as I looked at it that having jumped in the water, Peter perhaps had two reasons in doing that: to get to shore as soon as possible, and to try at the same time to help haul the net of fish at least into the shallows, or part way thereof, and hadn't really given any thought about what comes next. And that sounds familiar, doesn't it? When we react when we react impulsively rather than act with thought, we can get into confusion about where to next. And so Jesus gives instructions from the shore which help to resolve any awkwardness that may have arisen. He says in verse 10, Jesus saith unto them, bring of the fish which ye have now caught. And so that gives Peter something he could do, which he did virtually single-handedly on his own, having jumped out of the little ship, dragging the net out of the shallows and onto the shore. And at some point, someone counted them as any fisherman, whether amateur or professional, would do. 153 great fish, which is the point of the miracle. That is, when you count fish, you count them carefully. You don't just round them off, or about 150. It would have been 149, 150, 151, 152, 153 big fish. And as I said, that's the point of the miracle. And also we are told that the net did not break and none were lost. So also part of the miracle, or the sign by Jesus, may have been that they were larger than they would normally catch in the lake. They were great fish, and apparently they must have been of a similar size. Now I've omitted to put in that slide which shows the representation of a great haul of fish. Well, the disciples get to shore, Peter dragging the net to shore, no doubt eventually helped by the others, and someone who, as I said, counted the fish. And the disciples then saw that the meal that Jesus had prepared on the shore. So Jesus had prepared a meal of bread and fish, and it reminds us, of course, of the feeding of the 5,000, or several incidents of the feeding of multitudes with fish and with bread. So he instructed them to come and dine, which they gladly accepted. But they stood around in silence until Jesus served them. There was obviously some tension there, as I've said. They would have been tired and hungry and glad of the meal and the bread, bread and cooked fish, but not from their catch, but prepared by Jesus himself. So I suspect that there's more than one miracle in this sign recorded by John. There's no explanation by Jesus, or not recorded by John anyway, as to what has just occurred. It seems that Jesus left it to themselves to work out what it all meant. And so as they relaxed after their meal and the long night on the lake, each one of them was pondering what it meant, as we are tonight, doing the same thing. And I think they all knew what it meant, at least in part. They had been doing things their own way. They had gone back to their old life, even if it was only for a night or two or for a few days, and that had led to failure and frustration, as it does with us when we do things our own way. It was Jesus in the end who supplied their needs and would do so for the rest of their lives. And God has, through Jesus, has supplied our needs as well. But being human, we like to do things our own way, and that's when we get into trouble, isn't it? When we experience that feeling of failure and frustration ourselves, like they did at the time. But this was a turning point. This was a more important task than there was more, as Jesus went on to point out, and the miracle and signs showed that the disciples had a more important task than catching fish or making money. And it wasn't just 12 fish, was it? It was 153. So they would know from that it wasn't just about them. If it had been 12 fish, they would have thought, well, 12 disciples, even though there's only 7 of us here. But it wasn't about them because there was 153 fish. And they would have no doubt worked out that it was about the wider gospel net. It was the gathering of all sorts of men and women in the gospel net. And in the 8 signs of John, there were all sorts of people involved. And obviously not just them, but through the ages, there'd be many, many thousands, if not millions of people involved or at least caught in the gospel net. And they are all important to the Father. They are all the same to him. Not one is a bigger fish than another. They are all great fish in the Lord's eyes, and he wants to save all them that come to him. And as I said, the number is not rounded off to 150. It's exactly 153. And the net remained intact, so not one was lost. Well, why the number 153? The answer is I'm not sure. One thing is evident, as I've suggested, and that is that it's a significant number. It has a spiritual application to the preaching of the gospel, the gathering together in one net of many people out of the sea of nations, and not one will be lost. I have, as I said, I have a few, I don't know the answer, but I have a few suggestions, quite a few actually, which may be in your view or may not be in your view relevant. So let's suggest some of these ideas. First of all, there may have been exactly 153 nations at the time of Christ when this miracle and sign was happened. Also, we could look at the other end of history and say, well, there are currently about over 200 nations in the world today at the moment. that could easily change to exactly 153 nations at the Christ's return, or at the start of the kingdom, or when the temple's built, when the people out of all nations will go up to Jerusalem to worship the King. So there's a couple of suggestions. There may have been 153 species of fish in the lake, or that sounds a lot for one lake, or it could refer to literally in the waters around Israel, or even in the Mediterranean, the Sea of the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the waters in and around Israel, which was the location where the gospel net was to be cast by the apostles. It was the area around the Mediterranean, wasn't it? And that has been suggested by one of the commentators I read as a possibility. Now, the sons of Zebedee were James and John, and they had said to Jesus on a previous occasion, "Should we call down fire to destroy these Samaritans who did not receive Jesus as he would be expected to be received?" They hadn't received him like they had on a previous occasion. On previous occasion, they'd been very open and welcoming of Jesus' visit, but on another occasion they were not. And so James and John said to Jesus, "Should we call down fire on these Samaritans, just like Elijah did?" Well, the context obviously refers to Elijah calling down fire on those who were ordered to arrest him. Altogether, 153 soldiers and officers died that day, which is horrific, isn't it? Well, Jesus had replied to James and John, "You know not what spirit you are of. The Son of Man is not come to destroy lives, but to save lives." And that's the point of the 8th sign of John. But 153 people were involved in that incident, and the inference and contrast and the lesson to James and John here at the lake was that Jesus was anxious to, or wanting to save people, not kill them in judgment. So that was a good lesson to John, who was there at the time. In one of the references I looked at, there was listed all the people that Jesus blessed during his ministry, and apparently there were 153. I'm now going to explain this, try to explain this slide. Now, this particular image, or drawing as it were, is based on the 3 denials of Peter and the 3 pardons that Jesus gave him. So you've got the number 3 emphasised here. We know from the Proverbs that a 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. I believe this represents, in my mind, the fact that Jesus would draw all men to him eventually. And it also speaks to me of John's famous chapter and verse, "God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Now, that shape is no indication by any means, it's not representing the Trinity. Let me make that very clear. The Trinity is a myth. It's nothing to do with the Trinity. The Trinity is fake news, as we would use the term today. It is fake news from back in the 3rd, 4th and 5th centuries AD. It is not the good news of the kingdom, which the apostles spread throughout the world. And so we need to be aware of that. But it was a drawing or representation that I found in one of the notes, one of the books on John. And I've changed it slightly to get my head around it. And so you've got the 51 plus 51 is the 153, and the 17 times 9 is 153, so you've got the factors that make up 153 there. What else? I think that's As I said, that's not my concept. It was borrowed from other notes with some minor changes. There is obviously, as I've said, some significance in the actual number 153. In John chapter 1, verses 10 to 12, referring to the light of the world, John writes, "He was in the world," speaking of Jesus, "and the world was illuminated by him, and the world knew him not. He came to his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them he gave power to become the sons of God, even to as many that believe of them that believe on his name." So one of the major themes of the gospel and the letters of John the Apostle is the process by which we become the children of God. Also in 1 John chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, and 1 John chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, we have, as we've seen, the process, John emphasising the term the children of God, and now are we the children of God, etc. Those sort of quotes from the letters of John. Well, why mention all this? Well, the numerical value in the Hebrew, the gematria, as it's called, the numerical value of the Hebrew of the phrase sons of God equals 153. Apparently, I haven't been able to check this out, verify it for myself, but apparently that Simon, the son of Jonas, equals 153 as well in that numerical value system. And there are other functions of 153, or other words which are functions of 153 in numerical value. I won't go any further on that and use up too much time. I've emphasised that number 3 is the important number in this figure and in this explanation. 51 times 3 equals 153. 17 times 9, as I said, is 153, which would be 10 plus 7 times 9 equals 153. 10 represents perfect order or government. 7 equals spiritual perfection. We have the 7 colours made up, the 7 colours of the rainbow, which make up light, and is a very apt symbol of spiritual things, of spiritual perfection. And 9 equals finality, or can, in some instances, some context, equal judgment. So, as I said, I don't know what the answer to the actual significance of the number 153 is, but there are some suggestions. Before I summarise, I'd like to just say this. I said previously that this sign was a very personal one to Jesus' disciples and later on to John's readers. But possibly some details were made known to the village and townspeople as they came to collect the fish and benefited from the being able to consume the 153 large fish. I'm sure that, well, I don't know, but I was hoping that was part of the story, which is obviously not detailed here. But we are part of the 153, and I'd like to quote a commentator by means of summary who says, I don't know the page number, but I quote, "Until this point, the ministry of Christ had focused on the people of Israel, and still would be, but Jesus was preparing the apostles for a worldwide ministry. This means that Christ could have been directing them, or most likely I'd say he was directing them, to cast their net further than just the lands of their birth, unquote. So, as I said, in summary, we are part of that 153. And as I said, Jesus will draw all men and women to himself. And that process is still going on today, till he returns. Let's read the context of let's read firstly verse 14, leading on to verse 15. This is now the third time that Jesus showed himself to the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after that he was risen from the dead. So when they had dined, Jesus saith to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? He saith unto him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. He said unto him, Feed my lambs. So after the meal, Jesus breaks the silence and turns to Peter, which Peter knew was coming. He knew it was inevitable and needed to be said. Peter didn't know if he would be condemned by Jesus or not because of what had happened. When he saw the fire of coals on the beach, as mentioned in verse 9, no doubt Peter remembered what had happened when he had last stood around a fire of coals. That is, when he stood warming himself from the coal, when he stood with the others at Jesus' trial and had denied his Lord 3 times. Well, Jesus gently but firmly breaks through the guilt and the anguish that no doubt Peter was feeling, and he says to Simon Peter, Simon Jonas, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? And so there we have a breakdown of the narrative, the question of Jesus to Simon, to Peter, and then the reply of Peter to that question, and then the statement by Jesus as to what he should do in the future. So you've got that breaking. They're all broken down into 3 lots of 3. You've got the context of the 3 verses. You've got the meaning of each of those verses, and they're broken into the question on each verse, and the answer by Peter, and then the statement by Jesus as to what he should do from then on. So hopefully that makes it fairly clear as to what's being said at the time. Now, who or what are these that Jesus is referring to? Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? So who's Jesus referring to, or what is Jesus referring to? Is he referring perhaps to the fish and the occupation of fishing? So they've gone back to their old way of life to fill in the time? Or was Jesus referring to the fact that did Peter now love Jesus more than these, that is, the other disciples? I can't seem to make up my mind on those as to who Jesus was addressing, whether he was talking about the fish and the way of life that they previously led, or was he talking about the other disciples? And yes, we can talk about that afterwards. Thanks, Chris. Yeah. Peter and the other disciples would have known exactly what Jesus meant, because Jesus would have indicated with his hands, lovest thou me more than these, or lovest thou thee more than these, referring to the disciples. And he would have pointed either to the fish or to the his fellow disciples. First of all, I was leaning towards the first statement because I think Peter had some doubts about himself now. If I love the Lord, how could I deny him? Would have been thoughts going through his mind. He no longer thought that perhaps he didn't love the Lord like he thought he did because of the failure. He no longer thought about being ahead of the other disciples in anything anymore. So it was difficult for Peter to answer Jesus' probing and searching questions. And by the third appeal, Peter was getting quite emotional in front of his fellow disciples. So the first question, yes, Lord, he answers, yes, Lord, you know that I love thee. And it's the word phileo. Jesus had used, as the chart indicates, Jesus had used the word agape. Simon Peter, lovest thou me? On the first two occasions. On each occasion, Peter answered with the term phileo, which is not a self-sacrificing love like the word agape or agape. It's more of a friend, a regard for a friend. And 3 times Peter replied to the Lord, you know that I love thee. And by the third time, Jesus says to him, Simon, son of Jonas, do you love me? And that is the word phileo on the third time. So Jesus is basically saying, well, Simon, do you even love me as a friend? And so it's very challenging. And so by this time, Peter's really upset that Jesus would question he was even a friend. Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. So this is his experience that he has to go through. 3 denials and 3 denials forgiven. 3 affirmations or confessions of love and commitment to be followed and to follow Jesus' instruction to feed my lambs. Firstly, feed my lambs, and then find pasture for my lambs, and finally to feed my sheep. That is, as a shepherd would guide the sheep. So I hope that chart makes it clear what Jesus was saying and what Peter was answering with. Jesus knew that Peter could not wholeheartedly say he loved him in an agape sense anymore, although no doubt he wanted to. Peter had done that in the past and he had failed, and he just didn't feel confident enough to, and was reluctant to do that and again like he had in the past. But Jesus was calling Peter to a new vocation, actually. He was to leave his occupation of fishing, and instead he was to start a new vocation of being a shepherd to Jesus' flock. To not only love in word and tell everyone about it, but also to love in deed. And that eventually that the love of Peter for his Lord would grow and transform into a self-sacrificing love where it was greater than his own love of life. Let's turn to 1 Peter chapter 5. You probably guessed I was going to go here. 1 Peter chapter 5 tells us about Peter's attitude and his demeanour later in life. And so 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1. And this is the Apostle Peter writing, the elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint but willingly, not for filthy lucre but of a ready mind, not being as lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. So that when the chief shepherd shall appear, ye shall receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away. So what beautiful words showing the wisdom that Peter now possessed as an older man and as one of the shepherds of the flock. And that his love had transformed into a self-sacrificing love where he was taking care of others and other groups of believers. And so, like his fellow fisherman John, this 8th sign of Jesus was to change Peter's life and direction, and was never to be far from his thoughts. And we know that don't we, from his letters to the believers. And these are, as I said, these are words of an elder now, a shepherd of the flock, not focused on himself anymore, but feeding the sheep and the flock and being an example to others. So it's a narrative of the journey of Peter from failure and anguish to one of triumph, not over others, but as was the motive before, but over himself. And a great exhortation to every one of us in our journey of life, not to be so concerned about ourselves, but to care for others as well along the way. And back to John chapter 21, Peter now understood that he was forgiven by his Lord. His Lord had not rejected him, and he was being given, as it were, a second chance. And that he needed to follow, he no doubt needed to understand that he needed to follow his Lord to the end. And he now understood that. Well, three times Jesus spoke to Peter using his surname as well. He said, Simon, son of Jonas. So it's a very formal way of addressing Peter. It'd be like me saying Mr. Jeff Lyons at a holiday place or a resort, or saying Jeff, son of Douglas. It's a very formal term of address or term of reference. And so he said three times, Simon, son of Jonah. Why did he do that? Well, perhaps it was like a statement of pardon in the hearing of witnesses, which were the other disciples. Perhaps like the name Jonah is emphasised by Jesus. Perhaps like the prophet, he was being given another chance to serve God again. And when we look back on our journey, we like Jonah and Peter, need multiple chances, don't we, to try again and receive the grace and mercy of God to try again rather than giving up totally. And so let's read verses 18 to 19. Verily I say unto you, when thou wast young, speaking to Peter, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself and walkest whither thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee, and carry thee whither thou wouldest not. This spake he, signifying by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he saith unto him, Follow me. So those verses, Jesus' message to Peter, gives him a glimpse of his destiny, which was to lose his life and follow his Lord to the end, literally. There's no reference here to a protest from Peter, just a sense of resignation and, I suppose, hope that his faith would be sufficient. And probably, in a sense, a relief to Peter that he now could start again, as it were, and follow his Lord. However, there is an attempt by Peter to divert the attention away from himself and from this disturbing news. So he says in verse 21, Lord, what shall this man do? Talking about John, obviously. So what's it got to do with you, Jesus says, basically, in verse 22. You concentrate on following me. That's your task now. That's your goal. And that's good advice for us all, isn't it? Not to be worrying about what others are doing or what their path is. And we quite often have a tendency to compare ourselves with others, to follow others, to be influenced by others, and also to compete with others. And instead, we are not to be concerned about what God is doing with other people, even with our close friends. God is doing a work with everyone, but in a different way. And even our close friends have a different path to tread. And that's the Lord's work. We need to look to Jesus. That is, to focus on our shepherd, following his example, his voice and his guidance. And that, of course, takes a lifetime, doesn't it, to put that into practice. And that's the message that John leaves for us all at the end of his gospel. It's the reason for his words. It's the reason for his 8 signs. Every generation, every one of us walks a different path and journey to everyone else. And the message to everyone, in whatever circumstances they are in, is to follow Jesus. And so the plan for John was to be a different path to Peter. John, now, as we know, John had taken on the responsibility, as he'd been asked by the Lord, of caring for the needs of Mary, Jesus' mother, and was to live and see and hear and write down the revelation of his Lord many years later. Verse 24, this is that disciple which testifieth of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Amen.